So our second speaker, Dr. Sarah Gaway, is a senior lecturer in criminology, and she teaches subjects related to forensic psychology and criminology. Her current research interests are using machine learning to predict criminal behaviour, on malicious contamination, and the subject of her talk, the gendered nature of poisoning crimes.
So Sarah's telling you not to use any of these guys in recipes. I'm going to tell you not to use any of them on your neighbor or your neighbors or your enemies as well. That's my only concern about what I'm going to talk about here today. Right, hi everyone. So as Suzanne mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the gendered issues that come up when we're talking about poisoning crimes. And I'm going to start with ancient Greece and the story of Medea. Is anyone familiar with the story of Medea? All right, okay. I'm not going to quiz you on it. I'm not going to make you stand up. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Medea was the wife of Jason and the Argonauts fame. And Medea helped Jason out on his quest by providing him with ointments and potions that would protect him. As the story goes, after this, Jason actually left Medea for another woman. And so what Medea did to get revenge on Jason was that she sent a gown and a crown that had been soaked in poison to Jason's new lover, killing her and her father. So the reason I like the story of Medea here is because it involves these different tropes that we often see when we're talking about people who engage in poisoning crimes. Medea was often described as a sorceress or engaging in witchcraft. And here in this example, she also poisons her husband's new lover out of revenge, and in a cold-blooded manner executes her. And so these are some of the tropes that we actually see when we are looking at historical works, but also more modern tellings of who engages in poisoning crimes. But what does the literature actually say? So what do we actually see when we look at the data? Well, there haven't been that many studies actually looking at criminal poisonings. But the few studies that we have seen have shown us some interesting findings. So I'm going to start with, and that text is very small, but I'll tell you what it says on the screen, don't worry. I'm going to start with a study from 2010, which is a study of homicidal poisoners in Japan. And in that study, the author found that of the sample, 54% were women. And what he said was that, or what he hypothesized was that perhaps women are using poison more as a weapon because they're weak and small in stature, and they have to use something that's going to incapacitate stronger men to either kill them or take advantage of them. But actually, when we look at other studies, we don't see the same high proportion of females as perpetrators. So Westphier and colleagues in 2004 looked at a sample of US homicidal poisoners, and what they found was actually in their sample, only 40% of the perpetrators were women. Similarly, my colleague Margaret Wilson and I in 2017 looked at cases of worldwide poisonings. And we found when focusing on poisonings alone that the number of men and women were about equal as perpetrators of these crimes, so about 50% each. But when we expanded our definition of what we meant by poisoning to include all cases of malicious contamination, actually the number went down to about 40% of cases which were committed by female perpetrators. And this included things like food terrorism and also product tampering as well. So I'll come back to that in a minute, but it's important to say then what we're actually talking about when we're defining poisoning crimes. But what we see here is even though we have these tropes, we don't actually have a lot of evidence to suggest that women are more likely to be the perpetrators of poisoning incidents. So where does this idea of the female poisoner actually come from? And there's a few potential places. One of those is to think about violent crimes in general. Now, what we know is that women are less likely to commit violent crimes, and especially when we're looking at homicides, men are much more likely to be the perpetrators. As a point of comparison, there was one study from 2017 which looked at 40 years of homicide data in the United States and found that about 90% of homicides were committed by men. So we've got 10% of homicides generally in the United States committed by women, and then in comparison to some of the statistics I mentioned on the previous slide, maybe 40% of poisoning cases committed by women there. And so it's interesting and it's worth noting that there is that discrepancy, even though we don't see women more likely to be poisoners. But another thing that's of relevance here is how we actually define poisoning cases. So poisoning is still very much something that occurs in a domestic setting. So usually we're talking about being within the home, for instance, the victims being known to the perpetrator, and the perpetrator often serving directly a food, a meal, or a drink to the victim. And so we know that women are more often going to be responsible for the cleaning in the household and the cooking as well, which is relevant to us right here. And we also know that women tend to be more responsible for general caretaking as well. And that's important because when we're looking at homicidal poisonings, the most vulnerable age groups tend to be the very, very young and the very, very old. And so you can see how in some cases, instead of actually being a targeted malicious homicide, we might have someone die as a result of poisoning, which is a negligent caretaker, for instance. And then we have media representations as well that play a really important role here. So I'm sure you can all think of examples of a film or television series you watched that had some woman engaging in some type of poisoning. The first thing that tends to come to my mind is anyone a fan of Game of Thrones?
Yes.
Is everyone a bit scared to raise their hand after that? Admit that you're still hanging in after 2019. Yeah, so if you're thinking back to Game of Thrones, there's quite a few examples there of women poisoning other women, poisoning men, and a few men sneaking in there and engaging in poisoning too. And early on in the series, one of the main characters, Ned Stark, says, "I've always heard that poison was a woman's weapon," to which one of his advisors says, "Yes, women, cravens, and eunuchs." And it really sort of enforces this idea that poisoning is not only the woman's domain, but most decidedly not a man's domain, or who we're classifying as a man. And this also ties into what in psychology we refer to as heuristics. Heuristics here is a word that we use when we're talking about mental shortcuts that we use. Now we use these sort of mental shortcuts every day because we're bombarded with information, and it can be really difficult to make decisions constantly as we go throughout our day. And so we need these little shortcuts to help us out. One that's particularly relevant here is called the representativeness heuristic. And so it bases our judgments on what our archetype is or what our ideal is of a certain characteristic or category in our head. So if you've had a meal that's been poisoned, I don't mean to imply that I shouldn't gesture when there's a plate. If there's been a meal that's been poisoned and you have a man in front of you and a woman, again, I'm not now implying that the two of you are poisoners. You might then say which one of these individuals is closer to the archetype that you have in your mind. which might then indicate why you might assume that a woman is more likely to be a poisoner than a man, based on these sort of representations that we already have from film, television, and literature as well. And then finally, the last component worth mentioning here is something I've already alluded to, but it's how we actually define poisoning crimes. And this is how we as academics define poisoning, but also the sort of lay definitions that we use as well. So for instance, I mentioned that the number of female perpetrators changes significantly when we include things like product tampering and food terrorism in the mix as well. And you can think about how the numbers might change when we also include something like drug-facilitated sexual assault. So when we're talking about spiking of drinks occurring, out and about in a drinking establishment, these are crimes that are perpetrated predominantly by men against women. And often they're not included when we're talking about poisoning crimes. So as we're kind of moving forward, getting away from these old ideas, maybe these 19th century ideas of, a Victorian woman sort of slipping arsenic into her husband's tea, we should start thinking about what poisoning looks like in the modern sense and sort of challenging our preconceptions. Poisoning now, we might want to think about not just the individual as the perpetrator, but also corporations as perpetrators. I'm sure we can all think of maybe cases where companies, in an attempt to turn out a profit, have used materials that are potentially harmful to their customers. And we can also think about governments as well. So the use of poison weapons against civilians, for instance, and targeted assassinations as well. So these sort of things take us away from that idea of the Victorian, again, woman maybe slipping arsenic into coffee, or using parts from the potato plant to poison her neighbors. Thank you very much.